Okay, we're going to kind of start, and I'll run through a couple things as we begin. So if anybody is still coming in, they can still come in. But so 3 weeks ago, our first week, we just kind of introduced the whole topic that what we're focusing on over these 6 weeks is the division of the church and the fact that we've had a history of division in church, in the church, which is actually the lowercase c church, which is the global church, of uppercase C, which is local churches dividing, denominations dividing. And specifically, we're going to this topic because the Methodist Church is in a time right now where it's going through division. And we have churches that have already, like in Florida alone, the Florida Conference, which is what we're part of, we had 14 churches that left at our annual conference this year to join with the Global Methodist Church. So that was the first week. We kind of set it up. And so then last week, we started asking the questions focused around something that my professor had said in a class 30 years ago, in one of my seminary classes. He started the class with the crazy statement, well, really, maybe all of us should be Catholic today. And that started a maybe livid would be a better term, discussion in our class, some students calling him a heretic and different things, but it was leading towards something, and we're working towards that, but we're going to work towards it this week and next week, kind of answer it fully. But then through that, we started asking the question of, is the church and what the church has been about and the denominations and the divisions of the church been a good thing or a bad thing? Is it actually good or bad? And only one person said they thought it was good, which was John, and he has something he's going to share. But wait a few minutes. We're gonna get to that. But so basically, last week we really focused on the fact that in the first 500 years of the church, we went from this group of 120 believers that were meeting in an upper room to become a church that was called, they don't call themselves a denomination. In fact, I read an article this week. Well, it's one that we're going to give to you. The Catholic Church does not consider itself a denomination. It considers itself the church. So to become the church. And then in 500 more years, that divided into 2 denominations. And then another 500 years, it basically kind of spun off into 8 denominations, which then rapidly started spinning off into other denominations to where we get today in 2022, that depending on what you read, there's anywhere from 42 to 45,000 different denominations all over the world. And each one of those has subgroups and different things, and so we just have different churches and congregations and communities all over the world. So we had the question is, was it a good thing? And John, who was the only one that said yes, he thought it was, he had a little paragraph quote that he wanted to read today. So Don, you're our microphone controller. Can you give that to him? He wanted to prove his point.
Can you imagine a tree that has no branches? You'd have a palm tree.
You have to keep the mic at your mouth.
You'd have a palm tree that only went up. So the gist of what you were implying was, that the church today is in bad shape because it's fracturing. My point was that we have something to be proud of, not to be ashamed of. And here's a comment. This is from a book that I've been reading. It's called Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. It says, even non-Westerners have come to recognize the remarkable impact of the Christian faith in the West. Time magazine's well-respected correspondent Dave Echterman reported the summary of one of Chinese scholars' lecture to a group of 18 American tourists. One of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West all over the world. He said, we studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we did. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West has been so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. This lecturer was not some ill-informed crackpot. To the contrary, he represented one of China's premier academic research organizations, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We don't just find Western scholarly support for the Jewish Christian worldview, we find it in the East as well.
Thank you. And that's a good, your statement actually is a good argument statement that anybody can have and argue as well. So, because part of that I said, yeah, I like that, but part of it I would argue with as well. And for me, where it comes to is the answer to last week's question is yes, but it's also no. And that's where we're going to get between this week and next week. And to do that, we're going to look at the scripture. And I said the first week, I forgot to repeat it last week, that you really need to have your Bibles with you. So hopefully people have Bibles with them. If not, you have them on your phones or other places that you can follow. But before we do it, I just wanted to show this. So I need like 5 volunteers that can stand in place for... Stand still. Yeah, so 5, come on. Okay, so this is something that Jonathan Baker gave me the other day. So Bob, you're at this end, so you need to hold these 2 right there. And then we're going to start. This right here is a friend of Jonathan Baker's, did his PhD on the divisions. You want to hold right there? I had to promise that I'd try not to rip this.
Whoa. Can I go through it?
You have to go on the other side.
The finish line.
And these are just the major branches of Methodism. And I guess we didn't need 5 people. So this was this guy's doctoral dissertation. So if you look here, it starts in the 1500s. It really, the Reformation, so you have Calvinism, Pietism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, and Puritanism. So that's the 5. Then you have the other 2, the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox. And so then this is spreading. So all of this right here has both separated, and these are just the major lines. Every one of these has a whole bunch of sub-denominations and different things out of these traditions. But of Methodism that came apart and then has kind of come back together, even things from the Calvinists. So if you were an EUB in your background, any EUBs here that grew up in the Evangelical United Brethren, which joined with the Methodist Church in 1968. So they really came from a Reformed background. But all that comes together to create what we have is the United Methodist Church, and then the other one that's closest to us is the Wesleyan Church. So that just gives you an idea of how, because that was actually a question somebody had as well, that we've kind of come apart and come back together as the major streams, even though we continue to have all the other non-major streams. So there well,
There you go. Thank
okay. If anything happens, I'll blame you. No, I'll take the blame. Okay. Jonathan said when his friend did this, he said, I want a copy of that. So he had to pay for a copy of it to be printed, but he's used it a couple times in his church. So that just a little bit more from where we were at last week. So before we jump in to looking at the topic for today, just a short table activity again. If anybody new at your table, you don't know, always share your name. And then take our assignment from last week from paper to pavement, and then just share real quick, what was your main takeaway? Maybe where did you struggle, or where did you get an aha moment? And share that at your table for about 5 minutes. And then we'll jump into today's lesson. back together. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start answering the question, was it a good thing or was it a bad thing? And actually what we're getting to is not, that question is irrelevant. What we're getting to is, how does Jesus envision the church? And how do we live into that today? And so there's two questions that I think we have to ask, and one of them we're going to do today is to start to understand how we're called to live today as a church. The first question is, what did Jesus come to earth to do? Okay, do we all know the answer to that? It's simple, but we miss it almost always. And if we miss it, we miss something that's crucial in the New Testament. And the second question that we'll talk about next week that kind of brings everything that we've been doing together. In fact, I just was telling them, all your readings actually are all leading to next week. All the readings you've done, including the reading that we're doing today. So they've all been kind of building on each other towards next week. But next week, the question then is, so what did Jesus come to earth to do? Which leads to the second question, then how does the church fit into this? How does the church fit in to what Jesus came to do? Which ultimately leads us to our ultimate goal of then how do we live in to this vision of the church that Jesus has and that Jesus came to launch with his ministry. And so today we start with, what did Jesus come to do? So we're going to go through Scripture. I'm sorry I didn't put it on the screens. I could have, but actually I didn't want to take the time to do all that. I've been busy the last couple of days getting caught up. And so what we're talking about, I'm just going to give it, and I recommend this book. In fact, this book, I haven't had a book that rocked my life for about 2 or 3 years. And this book I actually bought probably 2 years ago, and it went on my shelf. And as I was preparing for this whole series, I was reading different things online, different articles, and like 3 different articles. In fact, one of the first articles you read was just an article about the conference where Andy Stanley had talked about the unity of the church, and that we're called to be united. But I kept reading stuff that kept referring back to this book. And I thought, I think I have that book. And so sure enough, I went in my library and pulled it out. And so he, in this book, I'm gonna say, well, first off, I'll give full disclosure. So when we were part of New Covenant, every year, Pastor Harold would take all the staff, all the senior staff, directors, and other pastors, and we would go to a conference in Orlando it was called a One Day with Andy Stanley. Does everybody know who Andy Stanley is? Andy Stanley is the pastor of North Point Church that's in North Atlanta. I think it's the first or second largest church in America today. I think they have like 5 or 6 campuses, and I think they're averaging like 55,000 people at their campuses. And there's things. So first off, how do I say this? I'm not a huge Andy Stanley fan. I'm not a opponent to him either, but I'm not necessarily a huge fan. I've read a couple of his things, and they never okay, they were okay. But I am a huge fan because they've documented that in most churches today are doing a miserable job of reaching and bringing people to Christ, right? We're mainly churches where we attract Christians and do different things. And Andy Stanley has worked hard, and they have a track record that has seen people that are totally outside the church, coming into faith. And so if somebody's doing that well, then I like to hear and know what they're doing, why they're doing it. Because ultimately, which I've said before, I've said in here, that's why we exist as a church, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And so he wrote this book, so this would have been about 4 years ago, and it was the last time that we went, it was the year before COVID, that Pastor Harold took all of us to his conference. This one day that they did every year was in a church in Claremont, actually, called Real Life Church, and the sanctuary holds probably about 2000s, big, huge sanctuary. And the first few times we went to it, it was always packed out. You would get there, it would be hard to find seats. And the last time I went to it was about 6 months after this book came out. And we went that year, there was about 500 people there because they were mad. People were mad at him. And so today, I may push buttons. But the book is called Irresistible: Reclaiming the New that Jesus Unleashed for the World. And well, as we go through, you'll know why people got upset with him. Even though what he says in this book is what I was taught, and yet I haven't lived into very well, and almost no Christians live into very well. And he's just bringing it to a forefront. But the question is, ultimately, it's not the way he puts it, but it is for me. It is, why did Jesus come to earth? What did he come to earth to do? So I'm actually so rocked on this book, I'm going to teach a class just on this book in the fall, or facilitate and get people to read it. But so I'm just going to, I can't go into all that he's gone into the book. So I'm giving kind of my summary and big picture following it, but also I'm adding a couple things that aren't from his book. But so I really, if I spur you today in any way, I recommend the book. And also, I'll be teaching it in the fall, so you'll have an opportunity to study through it. But so here's there's two things that I think he came to earth to do. The first one, which we almost never talk about, is that Jesus came to complete the old covenant. Okay? He came to complete the old covenant. Last week, I started with a scripture from Genesis 12, 1 through 3. It's where God has called Abram, and he is making a covenant with him. And he says, the Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, your father's family, go to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. And then it's this last line, which is central. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. The rest of the book of Genesis is actually God solidifying and bringing this covenant together. And there's two things to point out that's interesting from the beginning. So it's a covenant that God is making with a nation, not with a person or persons. And so always in the Old Testament, if you're reading the Old Testament, God is blessing or cursing the nation of Israel. So it's not whether Daryl screwed up and did something wrong, or Jim, or whoever, or Don, or whoever. But it's the nation of Israel. And he has a covenant with a nation. And the covenant ultimately is that through that covenant, he's going to bless the entire earth. Okay? The interesting thing is with Abraham, so it's actually a form of covenant, which in the Middle East in the 10th century BC is a common covenant, and it's a covenant that you do certain things, and it's a covenant of somebody that's superior and somebody that's inferior, somebody that has more rule, more power, and somebody that has less. And historically, the covenant it's a radical covenant in the time period it was written, because the covenant would always be made of, here's certain things I'm going to do, but you have to do these certain things. If you don't do them, basically, I'm killing you. That's kind of a short way to sum it up. And so they would ratify the covenant by butchering an animal, laying the pieces on both sides, and the person that was in the inferior position would walk through the things, and what it was signifying is that I have to live into your covenant that you've made with me, or I'm going to basically be slaughtered. I'm doomed, right? And yet, so God does this covenant. Abraham, he tells him to go out to get a steer. He cuts the steer up into pieces, does all the thing he's supposed to do. And yet, the radical thing is that it says that Abraham falls into this trance, and this pot, which represents God, goes through. So the radical thing is God is saying from the very beginning, I'm the one that's going to take ownership of the covenant. You don't have to. Okay? So right there, God has done this radical thing. But he's established this covenant. And then through the covenant, he gives them a law, the 10 Commandments. And then from there actually becomes deeper law and more rules. And we have the Levitical law, which comes up to over 600 different regulations and rules that the people have to live by. Most of them go around dietary things, sanitary things, and things to do with sexuality and that, and life things and that, which is the Levitical law. And the nation is called to live out that law, and that's how they follow God. And to do that, then to bless the nations. The ultimately is to share that with the nations of who God is and God's love. But Jesus came to complete the old covenant, okay? And so a lot of us miss that. With the birth of Jesus was the launching and the beginning of the end. That through the life and then death of Jesus, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant came to a completion. It was over. We no longer live in the Old Covenant. None of us do. Now, we still have this thing that we use both Testaments that make up our modern Bible. And so a lot of us put the Old Testament on the same level as the New Testament. And the Old Testament is sacred. It's the story of a people, but it is not our covenant. We do not live under the Old Covenant. And that's where we screw up as a church today, where we've screwed up off and on for 2 centuries. And which he has in this book, and I can give you other resources, because a lot of times you start talking about this, people say it's sacrilege. But if you go back in our history, that's been true throughout all history. Leaders have shown that and said that. And yet, we still, and I think it's because, what is it, in the 3rd grade, 4th grade, you're given your Bible, and you're said this is sacred, it's the Word of God, and all of it. And we don't establish that with our kids, that really the first more than half of it is this story leading up to the covenant that we live under, and so we place it all in equal footing. So if you've ever done, which this year we're just reading through the New Testament. Last year, a lot of us read through the entire Bible. And so as you read through the Old Testament, which I just looked on your book, which is about the Old Testament, a lot of people would come and say, well, I hate that passage. And I'd say, I do too. But it's speaking about a people and their story of how they're relating to the covenant of God, and it doesn't pertain to that to me today. It's for a different people, and it helps me to understand what happens in the New Testament, but it's not what I'm living under. So here's some passages that show us that's what Jesus came to do, that he came to complete the Old Testament. First off, Jesus tells us things in his ministry, and I've just chose a few things. Actually, I've started going through because this has just really grabbed me, and his whole ministry, he's talking about this, but I've just chosen a few of the biggies. First off, Jesus directly says in Matthew chapter 5 in verses 17 and 18, a passage a lot of people struggle with, but he says, don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. Accomplish their purpose is, in the language, in the Greek, is saying it's a completion. The word there in the Greek is a punctiliar word. It's saying, I've come to accomplish, to finish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. And Jesus is pointing right there to its purpose being achieved, which is in his death. And so he is right there laying out, I've come to finish this thing. That's why he also says things in Matthew 11:11. He's talking about John the Baptist, and he says, I tell you the truth, of all who ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist. He's saying he's the greatest of all the great prophets. Everything leads up to him. And yet, even the least person in the kingdom of heaven, which is the new covenant that's just being launched, even the least person in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he is. And so Jesus is saying, when I've completed my role, which isn't completed during his lifetime, it completes at his death and then resurrection, he's saying the least of us is greater than John, because we're under a new covenant, and it's a different covenant. Jesus talks about it in Luke chapter 21. He's talking about the temple, and he says, it says the story that they're walking and they're looking at the temple, and some of the disciples began talking about the majestic stonework of the temple and the memorial decorations on the walls. But Jesus said, the time is coming when all these things will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. And he is literally prophesying right there. And all these, I encourage you to go and read further on. He's prophesying the end of the sacramental system. And when did that happen? Yeah, AD 70, late 60s, is it 67 to 70, right in there? Rome comes in and they desecrate, they destroy the temple, and it's gone. And that put an end to the temple sacramental worship of the Old Testament. It was gone. Matthew 28. This is, to me, one of the biggies. Jesus came and told his disciples, I have been given all authority on heaven and earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of the nations, baptizing them in the law of Moses, in the Levitical law, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach these new disciples to obey all the commandments I have given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Peter, in Acts chapter 10, he's waiting for lunch to be made, and he goes up to rest on the roof of a house, and God comes to him in a vision and says, there's these men coming, and they're from the house of Cornelius, who is a Roman centurion. So he's a Gentile, he's a Roman. So even though now the church is launched, it's still in the first 10 chapters of Acts, they're still kind of staying only in Jews, and they're using Jewish tradition and custom to, so if somebody came to faith, they had to, in a sense, convert to Judaism, and which is to live under the law and the dietary constrictions and all the other things that went with it. And Peter gets this vision from God of food, of eating food that is an abomination. So there's things that are going on, because Peter is being shown food that he would never eat because he's a good Jew. So he's a follower of Jesus, but he's doing it within his own tradition, his own background. And yet the vision comes and says, take, kill, eat. And it does it 3 times. And then these people that Cornelius has sent come to the gate and knock. They invite Jesus to Cornelius' house, or not Jesus, but Peter. He's still kind of iffy. The Spirit kind of has to shove him, but he goes, and he gets to his house, and he realizes God is opening something else. I love it in Acts chapter 10, verse 34. It says, Peter, I wrote this from the Message. I love the wording of it. He says, Peter fairly exploded with his good news. It's God's own truth. Nothing could be plainer. God plays no favorites. It makes no difference who you are or where you're from. If you want God and are ready to do as he says, the door is open. The message he sent to the children of Israel, that through Jesus everything is being put together again, well, he's doing it everywhere among everyone. And so Peter opens up to this new thing. In fact, he then gets called back. He goes back to Jerusalem, and he has to defend himself, because actually, if you read in there, all Acts 10, 11, it says the circumcised believers that are with him, the Jewish believers in Christ that are with him, they welcome what happened, right? No, it says that they were bugged by it. What do you mean they get the Holy Spirit too? They haven't done anything. They haven't gone through all of our rules and regulations. There's a whole bunch of junk you have to go through to get yourself right. And yet God is just giving them the Holy Spirit without going through all that. That's rubbish. And he has to defend it. So then lastly, in Romans chapter 7, Paul I have. And if you read, once you get this in mind, this idea of the end of the Old Covenant, and you start reading Paul, it sticks out to you powerfully. And so Paul here to the church in Rome says, "So dear brothers and sisters, this is the point. You died to the power of the law," and he's specifically talking about the Levitical law, "when you died with Christ. And now you are united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, we can produce a harvest of good deeds for God." What did God say in Genesis chapter 12 when he calls Abram? He says, "You are going to do good deeds. You're going to bless the world." And he used Israel as his chosen nation to prepare for a point for Jesus to come. And Jesus ended that old covenant so that we could begin a new covenant. And through that covenant, then we're going out to bless the world. Of which last week we said we now have, and John shared from the chapter from the book, that we've gone out to the world. The gospel of Jesus Christ. The only thing I would argue with what you had, John, because I liked it, but I wouldn't say it's just from the West. I would say he has a misinterpreted view there, because missions has come and from all different places, not just the Christian West. But other than that, I loved your statement. So Jesus came to complete the old covenant. Okay, everybody got that right. Everybody knew that. So he also then came to begin or launch a new covenant. Okay, it's that simple. And the new covenant is much simpler. And it's a covenant that's based on a person, Jesus Christ, and is empowered by a person of the Holy Spirit under Father God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, active and present in our world today. And it's the new covenant which we live within. Ultimately, where we're going to go next week is we have to get this down, or else we'll always struggle with what we're called to be about. If we kind of don't wrap our minds around that. So in the some verses talking about the new covenant. First, from Jesus. And the biggest one is at the Last Supper. We go to this every week in worship. So Jesus, I just chose Matthew chapter 26. You could go from any of the passages. Matthew 26, starting in verse 26. It says, "As they were eating, Jesus took some bread and blessed it. Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, 'Take this and eat it, for this is my body.' And then he took a cup of wine, gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them. Listen to this. And he said, 'Each of you drink from this, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people.'" Jesus there is saying one of the most radical things in history. He's saying, this is the new covenant. I'm changing all of this. And the meal they're eating is the Passover meal. They're looking at this old covenant and this old rules. And Jesus is saying, here's the new thing. It's not that this is a sacrifice. This is something that you're doing. It's not the blood of the lamb that you're going to sacrifice at the temple to meet the rules. So for the next year, as a nation, we're sacrificially purified. But he's saying this confirms the covenant between God and his people, and it's in my blood. It's interesting that, again, just like God the Father did with Abram, who became Abraham, by going through the center of the covenant, Jesus in this new covenant is taking authority of it again. Our hope isn't in us, it's in Jesus. He's the one that exercises the commitment to the covenant. And he says, and it is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many. Mark my words, I will not drink wine again until the day I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom, which is a day that's coming. It's actually, I don't think he's talking about the end time there. He's talking about after he dies and is resurrected. And we're in the new kingdom, the time that we're in now, the time of the church, the time of the new covenant. Peter, so I used him earlier in Acts chapter 10, where he starts to go through this transformation. And by Acts chapter 15, he's fully kind of gone through his change. Because what happens is that they appoint two people, Paul and Barnabas, to start proclaiming the word. And it's interesting because if you read, and I would say go back and read the chapters. If you've been reading through the whole Bible, we're getting ready to start Acts, so you'll go through all this. But so where Paul and Barnabas are going out to start preaching, which actually a lot of Paul's letters end up being about this, is that the Judaizers, the people that want to keep Judaism as the center of the faith, that you can't have Christianity apart from this, and that the old covenant is part of it. It says that they keep coming everywhere Paul goes. They come behind and they start saying, no, what these guys have said is wrong. Half the letters of Paul in the New Testament are him confronting people that have come to say, no, throw out, you need to go back, you need to be circumcised, you need to do this and all that. And Paul's arguing and saying, no, that we no longer belong to that order. And so what happens right here in the book of Acts is in Antioch, it's the first place where all these Gentiles are starting to come to faith. And immediately from Jerusalem, these people go and say, well, you've got to now do all these things. What they're saying there is, you've got to now do the Levitical practices to become Jewish if you're going to be this follower of Christ. And so Peter, has been going through this transformation, starts this off, and in Acts chapter 15, beginning verse 7, he says, at the meeting, so they call it the Jerusalem Council, if you read in the scripture. At this meeting, after a long discussion, Peter stood and addressed them as follows. He said, brothers, you all know that God chose me from among you some time ago to preach to the Gentiles so that they could hear the good news and believe. God knows people's hearts, and he confirms that he accepts Gentiles by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. He made no distinction between us and them, for he cleansed their hearts through faith. So why are you now challenging God by burdening the Gentile believers with a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors were able to bear? Peter's laying it out there because the Jews, Israel, never lived into the yoke themselves. They always failed. So he says, why are we trying to burden them with something that we ourselves haven't been able to live into? And he says, we believe that all are saved the same way by the undeserved grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. Peter has made the full transition, and he's saying, this is the new covenant. We're living under something different. In fact, Paul then is going to, in a lot of his letters, say, even to the Jews, he says, you don't need to live under this stuff anymore. You've been set free. But if you want to, you can, but you don't have to. And certainly, the Gentiles, of which I think, do any of us here come from a Jewish background? So we're all Gentiles, so none of us have to live under the Levitical law. None of it pertains to us. Praise God for that. So Peter's come to that point. The last one I use on this is from the writer of Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, but Hebrews really goes a lot into this. And I just love this statement from Hebrews chapter 8, beginning verse 6. The writer says, but now Jesus, our high priest, we no longer have a priest in the temple. Now Jesus, our high priest, has been given a ministry that is far superior to the old priesthood. It's different. The old priesthood is gone. This is the new priesthood, and Jesus is the high priest. And he is the one who mediates for us a far better covenant with God based on better promises. They're laying it out. This is the promise. He says, if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need for a second covenant to replace it. So that all leads to this. So if Jesus came to end or complete or finish the old covenant, and he came to establish a new covenant, then for me the next thing I ask is, so what? Why does that matter? What does it even mean for us, and what does it matter? And so I'm going to start off with one more scripture, and then I'm just going to share some thoughts on it. And this is, to me, one of my favorites, is from James in the book of Acts. So James is the brother of Jesus. And so within, they think, probably about 10 years, James really became the head of the new church, which is significant in and of itself, because in the Gospels, Jesus' family is still kind of questioning him. Are you crazy? Are you doing these things? And here we are within 10 years of Jesus' death, that Jesus' younger brother is the head of the church. So to me, even when I became a Christian 40 years ago, this was one of those kind of key things. You know, if his brother said, this guy's it, there must be some validity, because how many of us, we look at our family and we see all the junk in them. I mean, my brother and sister don't even acknowledge that I'm a pastor, because they say, I know all the stupid things you did as a kid. So they bring that up to me whenever I try to preach to them. And yet James fully surrendered. And James, actually, tradition says, which Aquinas talks about, that James went to his death tortured, never denying Jesus as Lord and Savior. But James, so this is in the same dialogue that we had Peter. So Paul and Barnabas have come to Jerusalem to defend the Christians, the Gentiles that are becoming Christians. This is the first Gentiles. And so Peter gives his statement that we just read. But then James is now the leader of the council of the Christian leadership. And he says this powerful statement, and then they write a letter. It recommends that they write a letter back to the people. And here's what he says. And to me, this is the beginning of the so what. He says, and so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. And he says, and so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. So who are the Gentiles? It's everybody in the world that's not a Jew. That's it. And so James, a brother of Jesus, is saying, he's listening to all this, and he's saying, and in my judgment, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Let me tell you, we're going to end up going back to that next week. Acts 15, 19. I'm sorry. Acts 15, 19. We in the church have a horrible history of making it difficult for people to come to Jesus. And I don't know, from day one when I launched Lake Deaton, I want every messed up person in the world to come into our church. Really, I want every messed up person that lives in and around the villages that's in retirement to come into our church and to find an open, welcoming place that doesn't condemn them. And I'll challenge you on this. Go read the Gospels. It doesn't condemn them, but invites them into something better, which is a new covenant with Jesus Christ. And that covenant doesn't sit there and put regulations and rules and all this stuff. What it does is calls you into a relationship, and does call you into practices that I've now witnessed in ministry, and I wish I could say from the day I started ministry, but it took me a long time to figure this out. So it's been about the last 18 years. But I've learned in the last 18 years, when I welcome people and I stop trying to condemn them to hell, but I welcome them wherever they're at, point them to Christ, make it easy for them to hear the story and who He is and what the new covenant is, and then help them join into some practices of like reading Scripture and prayer and that, is that God does the rest, which is what He promises to do. And lives are transformed, and people get transformed, and they become radical, passionate followers of Christ. It's what it's all about, and it's about opening that door. He goes on, and he says, instead, we should write and tell them to abstain from eating food offered to idols, from sexual immorality, and from eating the meat of strangled animals, and from consuming blood. For the law of Moses have been preached in Jewish synagogues in every city on every Sabbath for many generations. Now, it's interesting there. So some people take that and say that means they're still calling them into some Levitical practices. But actually, as you read what I think he's doing, and I have to give credit to Andy Stanley, because I hadn't come up with this on my own, that what he's doing right there is he's calling them in to be united, because we're going to get to that next week. And so he's saying, what are the basics that if they don't do that, these Jewish believers just won't accept them? And he's trying to keep the church united. Because actually, within literally chapters, which would be within years, Paul is already in places where their coming is throwing out this stuff on what they eat and stuff. And as you read the letters, Paul is saying, yeah, it doesn't matter what you eat. It doesn't. So even there, so how does that jive with what James is saying? I think it's because James is literally giving recommendations for the church in Antioch of how can they worship together? How can we? And he's saying just keep these basic things. And even in those, he's not. So one of the things that we take, people use the sexual immorality to say, well, that's pointing back to Levitical law. If you read the list of the sexual immorality in the Levitical law, none of us here follow it, and it's like in Leviticus, it's like 5 or 6 pages of stuff that is really detailed, and none of us know it. So there's no way he's telling them, and these Gentiles have to learn all that law and live into it. He's talking about something else. And actually, just so you know, Andy Stanley says he's going to talk about that, but it's in a chapter I haven't gotten to yet. So I don't know the answer yet on where he's going with that. But I know it's there. So here's what I take from all that. That sets up with where we're going next week. And I'm sorry, I'm right at my time, but I'm going to run through this real quick. So first off, our hope is in Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. It's not in anything else. It's not in doing anything. And the second thing is, we are not bound by the Old Testament. Anybody that wants to use the Old Testament, I've just in the last 2 weeks sat with somebody that started bringing up all this Old Testament law and saying, we need to do all this. And I'm like, no, we don't. I don't live under the Old Covenant. And I'm not going to be yoked by that because I'm a Christian. I'm a disciple of Christ. I'm not a Jew. In fact, just so you know, none of us fit under the Old Covenant because none of us are Jews. So it's not even our law to live out. So with that, then, we are called to have a basic orthodoxy in Jesus Christ. Orthodoxy is right belief. And so there are, and we're going to get to this next week, there are things that we're called to believe that are biblical and that we're called to believe and live into our life. But we're given freedom in our orthopraxy, which is right action, which allows for customs and traditions to vary, which is a great thing. And so that, Andy Stanley has this quote. He says, whereas Gentile believers abandoned their pagan beliefs, they were called to a right belief in Jesus, not in the whole Old Testament, but in Jesus. They did not abandon their pagan behaviors. And they didn't. They brought their Gentile customs, habits, and values right along with them, many of which were offensive to the Jews, which actually led in the next 30 years after that time, where really there was a total split for the next 2,000 years. So here's the last few things. So in my mind, Jews can worship and surrender to Jesus and remain Jewish. It's okay. We have Messianic Jews. I actually have a guy that I want to get here next year and come and share with us, and I think it's wonderful because that they can keep their traditions, their customs, but it doesn't mean that Christians have to. In fact, we don't. Christians can be Christians wherever they are in their own culture and their own traditions. And that's actually where the gospel is taken off. In fact, my major in seminary, because we were preparing to go as missionaries, my major is actually missiology and cultural anthropology. I didn't study pastoral theology, which most people do in seminary, but I studied missiology, which is probably why I'm screwed up sometimes as a pastor. But one of the things I learned in missiology was how wonderful the Christian West, mainly the U.S. and Europe, in the beginning of the missionary movement, the modern missionary movement, which spread the gospel to the world. But it's interesting that in every country where the gospel is then taken off and laid hold to that country, it's always been in the second generation where it becomes indigenous, where leaders have been raised. So those missionaries came in, wonderfully used by God to transform lives. But then those people, which in almost every single instance wasn't huge numbers, took the gospel and they made it into their own culture. So they kept the orthodoxy, but they added orthopraxy to their culture. And that's where the gospel takes off everywhere. And so here's some modern examples of that right now that are happening, and even beyond just that immediate thing. So the whole Chinese church that's taking off, I actually did a major research project on Hudson Taylor, who was the first radical missionary in the modern times that left the borders, started getting a Chinese haircut, wore Chinese garb, and went inland, China Inland Mission, which radically changed people. But even there, they didn't see the impact until the Boer Revolution, where the Western missionaries had to leave. And when missions came back, they thought, oh, the church is going to be dead. And the church in China had quadrupled. It had gone crazy, but it was because it had become an indigenous church and continues to grow today, even with government trying to squash the church movement. But it's a very indigenous Chinese church, one that most of us would go to and think, this is so strange, I don't feel good here. It's weird. There's a great author, Watchman Nee, if you ever read any of his stuff, which is challenging to us Western Christians to read his stuff. The African church, the same thing, where it's becoming culturalized. Modern-day Messianic Jews are a great example. They keep their Judaism. One of my favorite, which I've done a lot of reading on, is the whole Insider movement. Has anybody heard about the Insider movement? So today, write that down, look it up. But today, in Muslim nations, so this actually started about 20 years ago, I think, maybe even before that. Christian missionaries who had been for decades, or not a century or more, had never made movement into the Muslim nations, started using the Quran next to the Bible, and they actually used the Quran with the Old Testament, and they work through that together to lead to the New Testament. And then when they get to the New Testament, these people give their heart to Jesus and become Christ followers. They do not leave Islam because culturally, so much of what we do in the West is abhorrent to them. And so they don't ask them to leave, and they don't leave Islam. And yet, their faith is not in the Quran. It's not in the Old Testament. It's in Jesus Christ, and it's becoming radical. One of the most televised imams in the Middle East is a Christ follower that's on TV every day, but he's still Islamic. Look it up. And it's fun to read the articles if you read and research, because depending on somebody's theological background, they either say this is an abomination because they can't still be a Muslim and be a Christ follower, or they applaud it and say it's wonderful what God's doing. But we'll be talking about that next week. It's called the Insider Movement. Yeah. Insider, INSIDER, the Insider Movement. I have no idea where the name came from. It's and it actually corresponded with two things. So it actually, which I have a good book in my office if anybody's interested in it. It started with Chinese Christians because China basically exports their citizens, and they do a lot of it into the Middle East, and they're really like slave labor, depending on what you read on it. And they go in, and those countries pay the Chinese government for the people to be there, and they get paid as well, but they actually get paid far less than the government's getting paid for them. In fact, I don't know if you know, the World Cup, there's a big movement to boycott the World Cup because almost all the building has been by Chinese laborers and other Eastern laborers that were brought in under that agreement. And so they're basically living at almost slave labor wages. And there's been, because the Arabs just don't care about them, there's just been tons of deaths. And so there's been a movement to boycott it. Our oldest son, who is a soccer nut, but is also really like socially conscious, is just struggling so hard. But my bet is that he's still going to watch the World Cup, even with his convictions, but he'll do it with grievance in his heart. But so these Chinese Christians, or so these Chinese were going out into all these Islamic nations, and it was actually a leader started saying, and they called it the Back to Jerusalem movement, is that we need to take the gospel into all these nations leading back to Jerusalem, because that's where we're all going out to work. And there's so many Chinese Christians today underground, and so they started covertly taking the gospel in to all these nations, which then Western missionaries kind of grabbed on, and some of the practices they were using, and the Insider Movement came out of that. So, and we don't ever talk about that here in the U.S., but I think they kind of like that we don't talk about it. If you read on it and it's something that you really become passionate about, there's a 4-day workshop at a Baptist church in Atlanta that they do every year that I've gone to, and it is powerful. It is powerful. So, any last question, comment? Yeah. Could you help pass them? Oh, no, I didn't say that. But
I went to a Messianic service
yeah.
with some of my circle people. And there were families that once they convert to Christianity, they ripped their clothing, they were in mourning, they considered them dead. So they had to leave their families. So how can they still be Jewish?
Well, they wouldn't be at that point. So what I was saying is, you can remain Jewish and still be a Christ follower. That's a Messianic Jew. But you don't have to be. And there are Jews that leave. I mean, I know of 2 Jewish people in our church that left Judaism for Christianity, and so they forsake everything of Judaism. And so yes, so you don't have to remain. So in the Insider Movement, if you're Muslim and you become a Christ follower and you totally flee there and don't want to be part of that, you can do that. But just because you remain Muslim doesn't mean that you can't be a follower of Christ either. So what I'm saying is, just to make the one comment back to last week in the denominations, I think that's part of, to me, why we have 42,000 plus denominations, is because the whole world is different and everything is indigenous. And even on a micro level, The Villages is certainly different than you can go 15 miles into middle of Leesburg, and it's culturally different than the Villages. So our church is going to be a different church and focus on different things than a First or whatever, the Morrison UMC in downtown Leesburg, because we're in different cultures, and so we're indigenous to the place where we're at. Thank you all. Well, let's pray. Lord God, thank you for this time, and I pray that I haven't totally been boring, but that this is, I know it's powerful for me. I pray it is for everyone, and Lord, that we would just continue to grow around your vision for the church and specifically for our church right here. In Christ's name, amen.